Okay. Hello, everyone. We are so happy to have you here with us on the Stronger Marriage webinar produced by the Utah Marriage Commission, hosted by Utah State University. I am Naya Phelps, and we're so excited to have you join us today. In today's webinar, we're so excited to be joined by Boone. Boone is a co-owner of Step Family Therapy in Spanish Fork, where he lives with his wife and two children. He specializes in trauma-informed approaches such as somatic experiences and internal family systems. His work also emphasizes systematic changes that allow for significant and long-term healing to occur, often by teaching family members how to become knowledgeable and validating therapeutic helpers. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, I'm going to have you drop it down in the Q&A thing down below just because the chat will be turned off. And then if you have joined us for the CEU credit, make sure you stay on until the end of the presentation. The survey needed for your credit will automatically load on your screen, and then you will receive an email from the Utah Marriage Commission with your certificate. You may also email the Utah Marriage Commission, which is at marriagecommission@usu.edu, to receive your survey on this webinar. Once the survey is completed, you will attain an email with your CEU credit certification. We will now turn the time over to Boone for his presentation.
Right. Thanks so much, Naya. Right. I am super excited to talk with you guys tonight. I didn't realize how the format was going to be, but I guess you'll all be just silently observing, um, and not talking out loud. That's a little bit intimidating, but I think we'll be okay. We are talking about boundaries and relationship building with our adult children. And isn't that exciting since most of us here are, well, I suppose we're all adult children, unless we have some young members of the audience. I'm an adult child, and I hope to have adult children one day. But the principles that we are going to talk about today are applicable to everyone in all scenarios. This isn't just about empty nesters with their millennial aged children. This applies to all relationships that we have. So we'll go ahead and get the presentation going here. Let's see. Special thanks to my wife, Caprina, for helping me um, manage the aesthetics of the slideshow. So, a little bit about me to start. This is my family. That is my wife, Caprina, with whom I co-own Steps Family Therapy here in Spanish Fork. She's a social worker, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. And then there's our son, Dominic, who is almost 7, and our daughter, Alif, who is 3.5. And they are just a riot. They are super hilarious. I love being a dad. I was born in 1995. That makes me 29 years old and right on the border of millennials and Gen Z. So I've got a good cultural knowledge of those two generations, and I am the third of 5 children to two Gen X parents, ages 58, 59. I believe they are attending with us tonight. We grew up military, moved around a bit. We were in California, Camp Pendleton, and Guam, outside of Orlando, and 3 years in Naples, Italy. All of these were naval stations. Dad was in the Navy, and then we moved back to Provo for my middle school years. I ended up going to Timpview High School, graduate of 2013. I went to BYU and studied anthropology, which is the study of cultures, and did an emphasis in African agricultural nonprofit development. Um, I did a big pivot in college towards marriage and family therapy, ended up applying to Auburn University, and then graduated in 2020. But probably the most relevant credential I have for this topic is my 6 years of adulthood living in my parents' basement, which I graduated recently in April of 2024. Um, Proud graduate with honors, and I believe I still have a solid relationship with my parents. So we'll be drawing from that experience as well as the many experiences I've had with families in similar situations, working with many parents around the age of my own and working with many young adults around my own age and helping them navigate relationship building and boundaries. So, so what is the issue of today? I need to move a couple of these things around on my screen. So, are the rising generation of adults, we're thinking about millennials, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, um, we're making up terms every day now, it seems. The rising generation is seen as more sensitive, less resilient, and more mentally ill than previous generations. There's a new book out called The Anxious Generation, which I think does a pretty good job outlining the is the significant shift that we are seeing in mental health profiles with the rapid changes in technology, starting around 2007 with the invention of the smartphone. So I highly recommend that book. I do have some arguments with it, but just throwing that out there. Having dependent adult children can be stressful and reduce the quality of life for aspiring retirees and empty nesters. I know that when I retire and my children move out, that I would like my life to be different. That I wouldn't like to continue parenting in the same way that I did when kids were living at home. And so, um, and so the principles that we learn today can help us to reduce the stress when that transition doesn't go super smoothly. And what we do know is that parents have significant impacts on the outcomes of their children, including by contributing to cycles of dependence. Um, we want to avoid parent shaming in this conversation. We don't want to say that all problems in children are caused by parents, but we do have to acknowledge a reality that our actions, our interactions have real effects on the people around us. And, and those effects are no more significant than in our own children. And so we're going to take that reality and see what we can learn from it, see how we can change our interactions to be of greater and healthier impact. Let's see, I don't think I'm able to see the chat at the moment to see like about any questions coming in, but I'm going to stop about a couple of slides in. I've got a place where I want to stop and start to look at questions. Okay, so just be patient with me as we get to that point. So, what do we know about these younger generations? Um, we don't believe in judging anyone or of stereotyping entire groups of people, especially generations, but maybe just some information for you out there to help us gain compassionate understanding. Um, this study, Deloitte 2015, was about millennials showing how they have greater job security than the generations before them, that they maintain their jobs for longer, have fewer job transitions. It's kind of general knowledge that the kids these days know more about mental health, though there is a lot of misinformation getting spread around on the internet. Mental health is an open conversation with the younger generations. The demands on them are not as rigorous in some ways, especially regarding social welfare, access to education, um, access to employment. Right? If you want to get a GED, if you want to get a job, you can go out and get it. If you are struggling, if you need help, it is not too hard to go out and receive government assistance. It's not a do or die situation in the United States of America as it often has, as it has been in the past. These kids have lower rates of other issues than their parents did. They drink less alcohol. They have fewer teen pregnancies. They actually have less sex than earlier generations, according to what data we have, and they have lower dropout rates. Right? They're more likely to finish high school than any of the previous generations before them. But they're facing different stressors that previous generations didn't have. We've seen lots of these kind of graphs floating around social media showing how, the average house these days costs 6 times the median income, whereas in certain parts of the 70s and 80s, it might have been just 1 year's salary that was worth the amount of the average house. And that has just steadily gotten worse over time. I recently bought a house, and that's the data that I was looking at when I was making that decision. But despite the differences that we have amongst generations, relationship and mental health principles are the same, right? These are timeless principles and things that we will be referring back to as we continue our conversation about boundaries and relationship building. So, number one, we develop emotional resilience when we are exposed to stress in manageable doses. We can we can analogize our emotional resilience to that of muscle resilience and muscle strength, right? When you work out, you get a workout that pushes your muscles to a certain point where the fibers are strained um, and torn just a little bit to the point where if they're allowed to rest and recover, they will come back together stronger. But if you work out too hard, then you are likely to cause a rupture that ends up weakening those muscles, that ends up causing damage. Trauma is a word that we can use for bodily injury and damage, and also emotional damage, right? When we're exposed to stress that cannot be processed or recovered from easily, or that is too much too soon. And we dissociate from pain that cannot be healed or recovered from. In a physical sense, if you have if you have trauma happening to some part of the body repeatedly, that part of the body starts to lose sensation. It doesn't mean that damage isn't still being done to that part of the body. It just means you don't feel it anymore. And that can lead to some serious problems. And it is the same effect with emotions. When we are not allowed to feel our emotions, if they're not allowed to run their course, then we eventually develop a numbness. And then those emotions are going to continue causing damage in other subtle ways, um, even if we aren't feeling them. So we may have a more in-depth discussion about that, but we want to be aware of these principles as we move forward here. So we're going to be talking about two huge concepts tonight. We're going to talk about boundaries and then validation, and we'll define those in greater terms, but we're going to start with boundaries because when talking about mental health, we use the oxygen mask principle, which means that we have to take care of ourselves before we are able to take care of someone else. We are no good, we are of no service to our fellow men if we are dead, right? Or if we are totally burnt out, or if we are just laden with our own resentment, right? Or our own stress and lack of health. So boundaries exist to help us maintain our own health before we can address the health of someone else. And this is for ours and their benefit. So a couple of definitions here that a lot of people get confused. We have the idea of rules, which are expectations or demands that we have for others. Or we might say where we are drawing the line. Okay, this is what we want to happen. Boundaries are the actions we take to protect our own or others' well-being. This is what happens when somebody crosses the line, or what actually exists at the line. Um, uh, Naya, I just got a little box thing popping up. We'll
Oh, you
say
can just click X. That's just the
yes.
attendance.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Okay, so yes, boundaries are the actions we take to protect our own or others' well-being. Um, and boundaries can always be defined with an if-then statement, right? Just like forming hypotheses in our seventh grade science class. If this happens, then this next thing is going to happen or is in place if this thing happens. Okay, if you can't describe it as an if then statement, chances are it's not a boundary or not an effective boundary. So, to help us with our discussion of boundaries, we will look at the greatest attempt at a boundary the world has ever seen. We have the Great Wall of China, 13,000 miles long, of large, compiled mounds that were later added on with stone infrastructure, um, to prevent opposing tribes and kingdoms from invading China. Um, and so we'll be thinking about things in terms of our health as the fertile, lush, rich, um, Chinese empire, and potential liabilities to that health as invading nomadic groups. So a little bit of reflection on our Great Walls. When a lot of parents come in and tell me, I tried really hard to set boundaries this week, and I ask them, okay, what did that look like? They say, well, I told my husband that he needs to do more housework, or I told my teenager that we were going to make a change if they kept going with their behavior, or I told them that they can't keep taking my car without asking, um, or I in the middle of our argument, I said, I don't want to talk about this anymore. Or I said, I'm not going to keep paying for everything. And none of these statements here are boundaries. I'll often follow up with, okay, but what was the boundary? Because none of these have a person taking responsibility for their own actions, or doing something that is actually going to help them in response to the actions of someone else that might be distressing for them. Okay, so none of these are boundaries. Um, and I can go ahead and reframe some of these to show what would actually make them a boundary, right? Because a boundary is not telling somebody what to do. It's not criticizing them. It is not doing something that forces them to make a change, right? A boundary is always something about us. So if we were to take this statement, I need you to do more housework, right? It's kind of a command, um, but more of like expression of a need, or an opinion. This could become a boundary if it was phrased in my terms, meaning I am feeling overwhelmed with the state of the house. Okay, I express a feeling there. If I continue to feel overwhelmed, then I'm going to pay someone to come help me clean the house. Okay, this doesn't make anybody do anything else. It allows the option for the person to make a decision of whether or not they want to help out with the house. But I'm not forcing anyone else to do something. I just want them to know, hey, this is what's going to happen if I continue to feel overwhelmed. This statement right here, I don't want to talk about this anymore. This is letting someone know your feelings on the situation. And this is a common situation where boundaries are required, where you need to step out of a conversation that is not helpful for anyone. So saying you don't want to talk about this anymore, like, might get the person to, you know, to stop the conversation, stop it short, so you guys can take a break, come back and talk about this later. But it also might not, right? You can reframe this as a boundary by saying, I'm feeling overwhelmed with this conversation. If we keep talking about this, I'm going to go take a walk, or I'm going to go to the bathroom, or I'm going to go on a drive. Okay, you are expressing what actions you are going to take in order to protect your emotional health. Saying, I'm not going to keep paying for everything. This might be true. You might actually not keep paying for everything anymore, for your adult child, maybe. But this doesn't mean anything unless you're actually willing to follow through on it. And if you're able to phrase it as an if-then statement that actually works for you. If you ask me for money, then I am not going to give it to you. Right? There's our if-then statement that would make this an actual boundary. So, what makes for good boundaries? One, they are well defined, meaning that everybody knows where the line is drawn, right? Or where the line could easily be drawn. If it seems shaky or we don't know where the line is actually drawn, then that's probably not a helpful boundary. Two, they are strong. The Great Wall of China is made out of stone in most places. It is at least 13 feet thick, sometimes like more than 30 feet thick, up to 40 feet high. Pretty difficult for invaders to get through that. Um, but not sure how much of you know about, you know, Chinese history, but the Great Khan actually made it through the wall at one point by just bribing the guard. So this it made it so that the entire 13,000-mile long wall was was obsolete because they weren't paying the guards enough to not accept bribes and allow the entire Mongol horde through the gates. So that was not a strong boundary. Um, Three, it is predictable, um, meaning that if there are, and I say predictable as opposed to stationary, meaning that the conditions are fairly known whether or not this is negotiable. Um, and this boundary isn't changing all the time, and it's not conditional on certain arbitrary factors. Meaning, um, if you if you were arrested every single time you went 10 miles over the speed limit, then you would know, okay, like there is, or like there is a hard line there. I can predict that there is a consequence for that kind of action. Um, but if you, but if you didn't know that, or you knew like you will only get a ticket or you only get arrested for one out of every 10,000 times that you go 10 over the speed limit, then you're probably going to cross that line a lot, right? And you might feel actually pretty kind of betrayed when you finally do get pulled over and say, like, wow, 9,000 other times I didn't get pulled over. I didn't get a ticket for that. This one time. And so that kind of boundary doesn't actually make for a good relationship between, people and law enforcement. And the fourth principle, they are protective. Um, the Great Wall is a great example here because it is not a weapon. It is just a wall. If you run into the wall, then you'll bonk your head on it, right? Um, but and you can't say that anybody attacked you, if you are just beating your head against the wall. Like maybe you could say that, but you don't really have an argument. What would be an issue is if people are like kind of hiking along next to the wall, but then they get arrows shot at them, right? Or they bonk their head against the wall and then somebody, drops rocks or hot oil on them. So that would be offensive, right? Rather than just protective. And if we're trying to maintain relationships with boundaries, then we cannot be shooting arrows from the wall. We cannot respond to broaches of the boundary with criticisms, with shaming, with aggressive actions, with punishments, right? The wall needs to do the talking for itself. I'm not gonna let you in to this space right here, but I don't need to force you to do anything, and I'm not gonna punish you because the wall itself takes care of my health. Okay. Okay. What makes boundaries relevant? So, the purpose of setting boundaries is to preserve your own health well being and allows you to contribute to the health and well being of others. If the goals are reversed, meaning that you have boundaries in order to prioritize someone else's health above your own, then we are going to get detrimental effects to both, more than likely. Or if the boundaries, the actions that you take exist to compel or force someone to do something, then you are probably exerting too much energy and too much stress, and you are hurting the relationship and health of somebody else. Because being forced to do things, kind of general psychological principle, um, doesn't lead to good outcomes. It might lead to temporary changes of behaviors, but it doesn't lead to changes in, someone's morality. It is more likely just to induce fear and anxiety. In long-term relationships, these boundaries need to allow access to basic needs. And I've got this picture here of the steppes of Mongolia to highlight um, why historically nomadic groups in this area have been tempted to invade other places. Because it is a cold, dry, harsh place to live, right? And if they're thinking about, the lush tropical climes of China and the riches therein, it makes sense. And the emperor of China is denying trade to these nomadic groups, which we have record of. Then it makes sense that they would try and push some boundaries to access some of the amenities of an easier place to live. Meaning that if these people are having a hard time getting their needs met, then they are very likely to try and continually invade the boundaries. Whereas if there is some sort of provisions made to help these people out, or allow like easy travel in and out and trade, then maybe they would be less likely to want to broach those boundaries. So, so addressing underlying needs, right? We're dealing with these long-term relationships. What are the needs we're looking at? So we got water, nutritious food, right? I'll bring that point up later. Shelter and physical safety, and love, connection, and validation. All humans need these things to stay alive. Okay, we are social creatures like the wolves or the chimpanzees or the elephants. We need to feel like we belong in the group, or else we die. Okay, if these things are available conditionally, meaning that they have to be earned in some sort of way, they're likely to become linked to an anxiety disorder, at least in our society, where like food, water, shelter are abundant, right? It's not an anxiety disorder if you are distressed out in the desert looking for water. Your anxiety is justified. It matches the situation. It's not a disorder. If any of the first three are withheld unnecessarily, then they threaten the fourth, meaning that if you make your child like earn the right to access water, then they're going to feel rather unloved by you. And if you make a child, earn their access to shelter, then that also is going to threaten the relationship. That's where we have some complicated situations to discuss maybe a little bit later. But just letting you know that those things are very likely to happen. The following things are not basic human needs: money, cell phone plan, delicious food, takeout and DoorDash and things like that, not necessary for human life. Use of your car or your internet or your TV or video games. And thus, the creation of conditions or boundaries around these things can foster motivation for self-improvement. These things can be, after someone has their basic needs met, these are things that can expand their life, right? These are things that can add flavor to your life once your basic needs are met. But if your basic needs are not met, then these things become liabilities. I'd say in the biggest way, if someone is feeling unloved, unconnected, and invalidated, then these things serve as drugs, right? Serve as substitutes for the happiness that comes with a sense of connection. So here we are to our definition of enabling, which is when we take actions that reduce another's distress, but don't actually help them grow. Or doing things for someone that they don't actually need to be done for them. An example is paying for a video game subscription, right? If we're doing this for someone else and they're just using it to waste a lot of time, then we are enabling this behavior. Even if they're saying, those video games, I need those to cope. I need those to make me feel better. Because it's not a basic human need, chances are it is perpetuating some sort of symptomology. Enabling is also when we don't take actions to protect our own health, which reduces our capacity to be helpful to someone else. such as, you heard from the therapist that you need to do some more listening and validating. And so you sit there and listen while someone just absolutely abuses you, or gaslights you or manipulates you, and just bring you down psychologically. This is not helpful to either of you. In those kinds of situations, you may need to take a break to be able to recognize, wait a second, I'm getting torn down too much here. I'm not going to throw any arrows back, but I am taking too much damage myself, so I need to get behind the wall, as it were, to protect myself. And what keeps us from being successful with our boundaries? So we have specific fears. Whoops, typoed there. Um, these are the things that I see a lot. People saying, I'm too afraid of them becoming angry or sad with me. I'm afraid of being a bad parent or being seen as a bad parent. I'm afraid that if I set a boundary, then they're going to fail, right? Or they're going to backslide, or they're just going to be in pain and distress. I'm afraid of my children rejecting me. I'm afraid of feeling lonely, that through that rejection, they will distance themselves and never come back and leave me by myself. Or I'm afraid of being punished. I'm afraid of the actions that they might take in response to my boundary. Okay? And these are valid fears, that can keep us from being successful with what might be a helpful boundary. But they are things that can be worked on. And those are fears that can be processed. And then another thing that makes it hard to hold boundaries are is our general stress levels. What I've got here is a diagram I call the brain and the bucket that helps us analyze how we're doing, right? What state we are in to interact effectively with someone else. And so we've got these three basic parts of the brain, right? Your calm, logical part. When you are doing good, your stress levels are not too high, and you can make a lot of like deliberate, calm decisions when you're in that state. There's the fight or flight, anxious, on edge state, that we have, where it is harder to follow through on plans, decisions, hard to be deliberate. And then there's the frozen, depressed state, where we just have access to our heart and lungs and can't really do anything more at that point. And there are a number of factors that determine what state we are in of those, our sleep, our diet, our water intake. But as far as therapy goes, we're talking about sources of stress. We have our traumatic stress, which is every bad thing that has ever happened to us that we have not healed from. Our systemic stress, all the things that are going on around us, like our school, our work, climate, the economy, our family, things like that. And then the daily stress, like what happened today? How is the weather today? What interactions did I have today that are causing me stress? And that leaves us with kind of the general marker of where we're going to be. This bucket is pretty close to the edge. So we might say this person is probably in their fight or flight state. They are feeling like pretty overwhelmed, pretty on edge and irritable. If the bucket floods over, like there's just too much, then they might enter a depressive state. But if they had more bandwidth, not so much trauma or not so much systemic stress, then maybe they'd be up in their logical brain in a good place to set boundaries. So at this point, I think I need to stop sharing to start taking a look at questions. Let me see if I can. Okay, so guys, I'm going to go ahead and pause here to leave it open to questions that we have about this concept of boundaries. And I'd love to, like, you can even be very specific if you want. But if there are thoughts you're having on, okay, so like what does it mean to have a boundary? Or is this a boundary? Um, or like what can I even have a boundary in certain scenarios? I'll leave it open for a few minutes for people to throw in some questions if they want. If not, then we'll go ahead and press forward with the conversation. I'll just give it a few more seconds here. rules versus boundaries. Let's see. Okay. The first question we got here was, when do you impose rules, or are they even necessary if your boundaries are solid? So, I would say that a rule has no power unless there is a boundary, or a consequence involved with it. Like you might have the rule, like no, like only 1 hour of TV time. But if there's no action that you're gonna take, if your kid tries to watch more than an hour of TV, then this rule doesn't actually mean anything, right? Like then your kid will just continue watching TV. If the consequence is nagging, right, just saying repeatedly, like, hey, you know the rule, like you got to turn off the TV, it's a rule, you got to turn it off, then that consequence is likely to just induce relationship strain. Um, whereas if you, whereas if it is known, like, yeah, if I try and watch more than an hour of TV, then mom's going to come in and turn off the TV. Then that might make someone upset, but it's not really a violation of the relationship because this was predictable. Um, and is less likely to induce relationship strain than nagging, because what nagging or constantly reminding does, or criticizing does, is it questions the person's integrity, right? It is likely to be seen as a personal attack. And feel free to follow up on that question, if you'd like. But yeah, if the boundaries are solid, um, if the boundaries are solid, then you don't need to like be always reminding people of rules, right? Because they're given. You don't need the police officer to say like, "Hey, do you know it's against the law to go over 10?" If you know every single time you go over 10, you're going to get a ticket. We have a question about addiction. So, there are lots of different kinds of addiction. Um, I think one of the more severe cases are where you see things like cocaine or alcohol or methamphetamine. And these are the kind of situations where where the boundary you have might have something to do with money. Like I'm not going to give you money directly because I don't think it's going to help you, and it may become a liability for myself, right? If you're continually using substances, right, or using money in dangerous ways, you might have a boundary of not letting this person in your house because if they are under the influence, or likely to bring these substances into your house, that actually could cause damage to you personally or to your property, or might have the cops coming over to your house. This is one of those situations where a boundary on shelter, a basic human need, might be necessary. And that being the case, it still might make the person upset, but because the logic is there of like if I don't set this boundary, then I or my property is at risk, that relationship is likely to recover from that in the future. Um, so let me think if there's other things on that. Yeah, addiction in any case is likely to produce. You'll have a person who's not in their rational brain a lot of the time, and so you shouldn't interact with them as if they are in the rational brain. You hold your boundaries, and you try not really hard not to fire back, not to convince, not to try and compel them to do anything different. You protect yourself, and that's going to be most likely to be helpful for you and them. All right. We have a question that says, what should a parent do if an adult child threatens to end their life if their parent doesn't write their college papers? So, this is a great question because this is one of the countering actions that we are most afraid of. Someone threatening to kill themselves if you don't do this thing that might be unhealthy, such as doing their homework for them. if they are actually feeling suicidal, then their college papers are last on their list of priorities. This person doesn't need to finish the semester right now. This person needs help. This person has some other basic needs that they are not meeting. Um, and so your boundary in that situation is if you threaten suicide, then I'm going to have the cops come over or I'm going to bring the ambulance over. Um, and be willing to follow through on that. Like we don't joke around with threats of suicide. And if the person actually is just using this threat in a manipulative way, then they'll back off, right? If they know that you are actually going to have the cops come over and talk to them. But if they're not, if they're serious, then like the cops or the ambulance come and this person can actually start to receive the help that they need. Okay. Because what they don't need is to advance in college in this mental health state. All right. At this point, guys, there's a couple other questions in there that I'm going to pause on to get to just a little bit more material that I think will be very important for us. Maybe I can answer this one really fast. Boundaries require mutual agreement as to the consequence for crossing. It's very diplomatic if you can come to an agreement, but I don't think that would be necessary. Um, you know, Genghis Khan and the Mongol horde probably wouldn't have agreed to resistance from the Chinese Empire, right? If they said like, hey, if you try and cross our walls, then we're gonna fight you guys back. They would have said, no, we don't actually agree to that. And the Chinese emperor wouldn't have been like, oh, okay, sorry. Like I won't try and fight you guys. Um, or you don't have to say like, hey, if you give me another black eye, like if domestic violence continues to happen, then I'm going to leave the relationship. And the person says, no, I don't agree to that. But you wouldn't, concede on that point. You would just say, sorry, we haven't agreed on the consequence of the boundary, but I'm still out. So not always necessary, but you might make an attempt in order to be diplomatic. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and press onward. We have about 7 more minutes here to cover some material on the concept of validation. Which is the other part, right? Which is helping the person meet their underlying needs. And so, what I want to introduce to you here is what validation actually means, right? To demonstrate someone's inherent unconditional value by meeting them where they're at, refraining from judgment and assuming they're doing the best with what they have, and recognizing valid reasons for why they're thinking, feeling, or behaving in a certain way and treating them accordingly. This means we are not criticizing or accusing people of essentially of character flaws. Um, because one, we don't know what's actually going on inside somebody else, right? We don't know their intentions. Um, we don't know the true reasons why, but we can assume that there is a logical reason. If you go talk to a mental health professional, they'll be able to say, like, oh, this behavior comes from the following conditions. It's not because the person's bad, it's because they're missing something. Right? We never treat someone as if they're stupid, lazy, inconsiderate, ungrateful, etc. Um, but validation doesn't necessarily mean that you agree with someone or that you accommodate their thoughts, feelings, or behaviors. Validation means that you treat them as if they are worth being treated well. And and validating treatment for an alcoholic might be saying, I'm not going to give you money. Right? They might say, oh, you don't care about me, like you don't love me. But you, in your upper brain, know that you are showing more love to this person by not enabling their behavior, not helping them cause destruction, than you would be by trying to accommodate it. So, how do we help someone feel valid? How do we help them feel unconditional worth? So, this is the STEPS model. A number of psychological experts have posited different forms of this. This is my own simplified version that I've got, which tells us how to interact with somebody in those different emotional states. When someone is down in the frozen, depressed state, right, and they just have access to those basic heart and lung functions, and they're really not doing much else. They, like all other animals, need space to breathe. right? They don't need to be taught things. They don't need to be pushed to do things. They actually just need to breathe, and that will help them enter a more functional state, an emotional state, right? They'll move into those emotions that overwhelmed them and sent them into the depressed state. When they come out of it and they are in an emotional state, we need to listen and validate. So, listening and validating just means allowing them to express their feelings, how in whatever way feels safe enough to you, right? This doesn't mean you just let them punch you or verbally abuse you per se. You don't necessarily have to do that. But then after receiving those feelings, validating them, meaning you indicate that it's okay for the person to have these emotions. Emotions happen whether we like it or not. And so when we recognize, okay, you're having these emotions, it's okay that you're having these emotions. I accept you while you are having these emotions. Or it even makes sense that you're having these emotions. That's how you validate someone. And that's what will help them digest their emotions and enter that logical state where they can be taught something, where they can receive new information from you. Here's the more complex version that lets us know like some of the nuances of how to interact. That you don't want to validate somebody's feelings too soon before you've listened to them effectively and shown that you actually understand what they're feeling, right? You don't say like, "Oh, that makes sense," or "Oh, I'm so sorry that you're feeling that way." Um, if they feel like because they that won't feel good to them if it feels like you haven't actually listened enough, right, and heard the whole story. Self-help is the offer of, once they come out of this logical state, saying, well, what are your ideas? Like, what do you think about this situation? A lot of times when people come out of emotional states, they know the answers to their own problem, right? If an answer to their problem seems obvious, then chances are they just need to get back up to their logical brain in order to enact that obvious answer. And so as a therapist, I ask them, well, like now that you've spent your time, getting your anger out or crying it out, what do you think you should do? And chances are they'll say like, Boone, I know what I need to do. I just needed to, digest my anxiety about this. And after giving that opportunity, then we offer our own help. Would you like to hear my thoughts on this? And if that is accepted, that offer of help is accepted, then we can start to offer solutions to them. And only in the most logical state are teaching or challenging likely to be received very well and graciously. If you try and teach or challenge someone when they are in their non-logical brain, they're likely to view it as highly offensive because these parts of the brain cannot ingest logic. Okay, only the logical part of the brain can. So we make the biggest mistake of trying to teach or give suggestions to people when they're down here, right, in their emotional state. And I'm sure, as you found, it's not very helpful. But in all this, as we're going through any stage, trying to validate someone, right, trying to help someone feel safe and loved by us by meeting them where they're at, boundaries can exist. Okay. You don't need to let this form of emotional expression hurt you. You're allowed to have boundaries there. If you find that is too distressing for you to sit with your depressed loved one as they express shame and hopelessness, then you are allowed to take breaks. You're allowed to say, I find that this is actually bringing me down too much. I need to go get some therapy, or I need to go take a breath before I can be helpful here. Right? That is a valid response. You don't need to kill yourself in order to try and like, you don't need to lose yourself in the pit to try and rescue someone else, right? You need to take care of yourself first. This person is counting on you to stay healthy. Um, and then this is the more complicated thing, like that can help you with situations like with OCD or borderline personality disorder, like really tough emotional states that people can be in. I'm not going to go through every part of this diagram here, but suffice it to say that it helps us nuance different situations, and you can reach out to me individually if you want to access to that. Also, it's just on the blog. I'm going to, we have 10 minutes left, which is the time allotted to us to receive a few more questions. So I'm sorry I can't have the diagrams up at the same time as I'm answering questions. It seems like maybe there's a way to do that, but I don't know how. I'm going to go ahead and take a look at the other questions that might be coming in. Okay. So we have a question here that says, what is the quickest way to know if someone is in the lower brain versus the logical brain? Great question. So one, if their thoughts, behaviors, or emotions, or yeah, if their thoughts or behaviors don't make sense, right? If it doesn't seem logical what they're doing, then there's a decent chance that they're actually in their lower reptile brain. People act all the time as if they are in their logical brain. Um, but but if it seems like what they're doing doesn't make sense, their logic doesn't follow, then they might actually just be disguising their emotional state. Um, so, so this is something that you'll see a lot with, personality disorders. You'll see it a lot in OCD, like folks who are actually really anxious all the time, but going through their day looking very, very functional. Some other signs, if some people are like flexing something, or they're tapping their foot a lot, or they're shifting, like moving a lot, that's another sign that somebody is actually in a distressed state. If their brows are always furrowed, somebody might be hiding a distressed state. And then, of course, the obvious signs of expressing anxiety, panic, anger, things like that. Okay. Um, how can you tell if they're in the anxious state versus the freeze state? So the freeze state is pretty obvious. If this person is having trouble responding, if this person is looking despondent, um, if they're moving slowly, if they are like if it seems like they're unable to talk back very effectively, chances are they're feeling frozen. Um, yeah, I think freeze state is probably the easiest one to identify because this person feels incapable of doing anything. Of course, there are times when people might pretend to be in the freeze state. They're actually feeling anxious, but they're acting frozen. An example of this might be, you walk in on your young adult or your teenager who's supposed to be at work or at school or something, um, but they're just like in their bed on their phone. We'll use example of a teenager. Like you come in and see that they're supposed to be at school, but they're in bed on their phone. And they say, I'm feeling too depressed today to go to school. And you, like holding boundaries as you do in these kinds of situations, say, okay, I hear you. Like, I'll take the phone, the internet's turned off. I got the TV plugs and everything. You're feeling depressed. And so that means you need space. You need to stay home and rest. And if a person is really depressed, then they will be grateful. Like, okay, thank you so much. I just really needed no stimulation today. I just needed to stay home and sleep. Like, they'll be happy for that. But if it's a teenager who's feeling anxious, pretending to be depressed, then they'll say, like, okay, okay, okay. I just had a really awkward interaction with, my friend yesterday, and I don't want to see them. Okay. And then they can start to process their real anxiety and not pretend to be frozen. Let's see. We've got a case here. What if the child, what if it is the child that is setting the boundaries, um, and not talking to the parent, or they're keeping grandchildren away from the parent? What are you supposed to do to get answers to this behavior when no boundary was even set verbally before, right? It looks like your child is withholding access to your grandchildren. They didn't say why. They didn't say that they were going to do this, but it seems pretty obvious that this is the case. So this is a really tough situation because the parent has full rights to do, like to take their children or allow their children access to whomever they want. And that might not feel fair, right? Especially if we feel like like one, we derive joy from interactions with our grandchildren, but also maybe we have positive influence. Whereas we might see, you know, their parents exerting some sort of negative influence. Um, so I don't think you're likely to get very far by trying to challenge this person, right? By challenging this child, saying, "Hey, it is not right for you to withhold the grandchildren. It is not right for you to ghost me, right? To not talk to me anymore." Because that's just this person is indicating that they are feeling frozen, right? That they are feeling stressed about something about the situation, and thus they are taking space. Whether or not that's the right thing is open to debate, but we cannot question the fact that they are feeling the need to take space. And you're more likely to get further with that by allowing the space, by saying, like, if you say anything at all, hey, I recognize it seems like you're taking some distance, and I recognize that. And if at some point you want to talk about it, I would be open to hearing you without trying to argue with you. And over time, this person may start to feel safer and they might accept your invitation, but it needs to come in the form of an invitation, not some sort of guilt tripping or compulsion to have that conversation. And when that person finally does come to say, "Hey, I'm keeping my kids away from you because I'm afraid of the following things," you listen to that and you validate it. You say, "Okay, I hear you, and like help me understand that more," or it makes sense that you're feeling that way, and maybe there's some changes that I can make to help you feel safer to bring the kids around. um, this is a really this is a really tough conversation, um, and I think could use some individual consultation with a professional on it. Thanks for sending that in, though. All right, we might have time for one more question, guys. Okay. I'll go ahead and pull up just the last bit here so that you guys can reach out to me individually if you'd like. Oh, what do you know? I could bring the Q&A up at the same time. Um, let's see. So this is my contact. If you want to get hold of me in some way, I'm happy to respond to emails about particular questions, situations, or resources. If you'd like, you can check out the Instagram. There's lots of stuff on boundaries there, as well as stuff with steps model. All the diagrams that you found today are right there on the blog, stepsfamilytherapy.blogspot.com. There are a few YouTube videos that accompany those blogs. And then the Steps with Boone podcast, you can find on any major streamer, is actually the audio version of the blog for to just increase accessibility for other people, that might not want to sit down and read something but like to listen to things.
All right. Thank you so much, Boone, for that presentation. That was awesome. And thank you to everyone that joined us today on this webinar. We're grateful for your questions and everybody's participation. Once again, if you did attend this webinar for the CEU credit, make sure to stay on until the end so that survey pops up for you, or you can email the UMC email at marriagecommission@usu.edu for your survey. And then once you complete that, you will get your certificate. Just a reminder, once I click end, everybody will disappear, so get any information that you need. Thanks again, Boone. That was awesome, and I hope everybody else has a great night.